Okay, and it's 1 o'clock. So we're going to get started. We want to make sure that we use your time wisely. So my name is James Kelly. I am the Chief Sales and Marketing Officer for United Methodist Retirement Communities in Porter Hills. I have been working here for about 3 years. I love this job. I love what we do. I'm second generation working in senior living, so followed in my father's footsteps here. What that kind of means is that I have a really good understanding of what retirement communities are like and what some people like and what some people don't like. And, we're very happy to share that information with you whenever we can. I'd like to give you a little bit of a screen introduction. So when you look at the bottom of your screen, there's a few more buttons that are on here than what you would normally see. This is kind of the manager's perspective. But the big ones that you're going to need are going to be your unmute button and then your start video button. Now, right now, you are all muted. So we have muted you and we are not using your video. We're using our video, of course. You won't be able to start your video or talk with us. But if you do want to talk with us, the next button over here is the chat button. So I am managing that chat button. And so I'm going to send a little note right here to everybody. Hello and welcome. And I will manage the questions as they come through. And so if we want to interject and ask Brad a question, or if we want to wait till the end to ask questions, we can do that. But I like that this shows you how to do it. So the next slide here talks a little bit about where your questions go, and you'll see them, and you should be seeing my hello and welcome. So if you want to write back, you can, that's fine. So let's go to the next slide. All right, now on that top right-hand button there, you can increase the full size of your screen. You can change your gallery view, which means you can change how you see us, whether you see our faces or just the presentation, but up to you on that one. So, all right, and the next thing I want to share with you is that we will record this session so we can share it with you later. So if you have, think you misheard something or want a little bit more information about something, you can do that. The purpose of this event really is for us to provide a professional to you that would be able to give you some insight into what are financial times like during COVID here. So this is not a solicitation for business. We are hoping that we can get some information out of this, that you can get some information out of this. Brad's not looking at getting clients out of this, but we are looking at, this is the type of seminars that we hold on our campuses on a regular basis, part of our educational series. And so we like to be able to share some information about what the market's doing and what's going on out there. So without further ado, we're going to meet with Brad Breeding. He's the National Certified Financial Planner, and he's going to talk with us about what to expect in these times of COVID.
All right. Well, thank you, James. I really appreciate the introduction. Thank you so much for the invitation to come and present on behalf of Porter Hills and UMRC. Really appreciate that. Thank you all for joining us. It's great to have you on the call today. So just a little bit more information about my background before I jump in. That'll give you some context for our call. So I currently am the president of a company called MyLifeSite, or mylifesite.net. It's an online resource for tools, information, and guidance related to what I generally call complex senior living decisions. Prior to starting that company, I was in the financial planning business for about 14 years. And so today I'm going to be kind of drawing on some of that previous experience and looking at where that intersects with senior living and so forth. But the one thing I always like to mention is that I'm not in the financial planning business any longer. I don't manage money. I don't give financial guidance. I'm out of that business. And so everything I share with you today is just purely objective, just my views on various things in the hopes that it will help you a little bit as you plan for your future. Along those lines, very quickly, anything that I do share with you related to the market or investment type things, anything like that, should not be viewed as personal financial guidance or investment advice. I am I would encourage you to talk with your own financial professionals or your own tax advisors before making any decisions about your own situation. So some of the things I'm going to cover with you. Number one, what are the keys to financial security? I think that's, in any type of environment, whether the market's doing really well or not so good or a lot of volatility like today, what are the keys that we really need to kind of keep in mind? How should you be thinking about your investments right now? What are some things to maybe, help guide you through this time? Is it a good time to sell a home or move? That's probably on some of your minds right now. Is this a good time to sell your home? Maybe move to one of the Porter Hills locations or so forth. How can I be sure I'm making the right senior living decision? We'll talk about how senior living or retirement living kind of fits into the bigger retirement plan. Is senior living still safe? Is it still something people want to do? We'll talk about that because that's been a question I've gotten a lot lately. And then, of course, we'll touch on a few other things to kind of wrap it up at the end. So I want to begin by sharing with you one of my favorite quotes. Everyone has a plan until they get punched. This comes from Mike Tyson. And when I first started doing some of these webinars a few months ago, this really came to mind as I was preparing my content. This quote came to mind because in so many ways, it kind of feels like we've been punched. The whole coronavirus situation sort of came out of nowhere and, kind of turned everything upside down. Certainly the markets, the economy, our society in general, certainly senior living and so forth. And so during times like that, it's really easy to get off plan or to get off track and kind of get knocked off our feet, so to speak. So how do we stay grounded? Again, how do we maintain financial security during uncertain times? Well, in my opinion, there's really three keys to financial confidence. And if any of these three things are missing, it becomes very difficult to maintain financial confidence. So perspective, objective, and plan. If, for instance, we don't keep perspective about things, then it's really easy to let our emotions drive our decisions. If we don't have very clear objectives, then it's really difficult to have a plan, or at least an effective plan, because we don't have any objectives to tie that to. So what I want to do now is spend a little bit of time going through each of these individually. So when we talk about perspective, the next few slides, I'm just going to take a look at kind of what's going on in the market. I know many of you on the call, maybe there's some concerns about, your accounts or your account values or the volatility. So a few things that I'd just like to go through and point out to you that may be helpful. The first thing I've been asking is, how did you feel about your financial situation in 2016? Now, you may say, well, what's the big deal with 2016? Well, there's nothing unique about that year in particular. What I'm really doing is I'm just saying, if you could go back several years, and let's just suppose you had no idea what was going to happen in 2017 or 18 or 19 and beyond, and you just could stop time there, and I asked you this question, I would suspect that many of you on this call, maybe not all of you, but many of you would have said, well, we feel pretty good about things. We rebounded substantially from the Great Recession and the housing crisis of 07 and 08. Stock market was on this kind of continual climb, kind of felt like it would just keep going up forever. Obviously the economy was starting to rebound in many different ways. And so keep this question in mind. I'll come back to this in just a couple of slides. So first, let's take a look at what's been taking place in the market over the last 6 months. Now, I'm looking at the Wilshire 5000. I have a Southern accent. You might pronounce that word a little bit differently than me. But anyway, this looks at 5,000 stocks across the United States. Big, large cap, small cap, mid cap. So it's a really aggregate view of the stock market in the U.S. Now, I know there's other markets, international markets and things of that nature as well. But just here in the U.S., you can see what's taken place here over the last 6 months. I mean, we had this huge decline, obviously, of 30%, a little over 30% when coronavirus first appeared. And that was a really dramatic drop. And then obviously a pretty impressive rebound since then. Maybe some would say a surprising rebound. I think the The stimulus that was announced very quickly early on helped a lot. We can certainly debate whether that's had the effect in different parts of the economy that it could have, or whether there should be another one or what have you. But nonetheless, I do think that helped a lot from the stock market's perspective, as well as some other things that I'll touch on in a moment. But one of the things that you'll always notice if you pay attention to the headlines or, wherever you get your news, they tend to always focus on the decline or the drop from the high. It'll say the market's down X% from the highs or X% from the all-time highs. And I think it's really important to remember that, again, if you look at this chart right before coronavirus, the market was just kind of going up and up and up. We were at the end of a just over 10-year bull run, the longest bull run in the history of the stock market. And this point marks the highest point of the stock market ever. So the market was really at a high point. And so, yes, this was a dramatic decline that none of us really wanted to see. We probably wondered if it would go lower. But one of the things I try to explain to people is if we widen our view a little bit, obviously we have had this rebound that we're looking at here. But if you look at the last 6 months, the reality is that the market's down about 3.7%. Now, just last week, it was almost break even. We were at about, just over break even, like maybe 0.1% or something like that. But with this volatility in the market, even within a day or two, things can change pretty dramatically. But again, with all the volatility, it certainly feels a lot worse than this. But the reality is over the last 6 months, the market's down about 3.7%. Probably less than that for most of you, because I would assume that you're allocated with some bonds and things like that as well. So for many of you on the call, you may be about the same place you were 6 months ago. Now, remember I asked you about 2016. How would you have felt in 2016? Well, if you look at this chart, and we go all the way down here at the bottom, early in 2016, if you had said, again, if you didn't know what was going to happen next in 2017 and beyond, but if you could stop and you said, well, we feel pretty good about things. Well, in that case, you would feel really good about things now because we're up about 62% cumulatively since that time. Now, that's even with the volatility that we've had most recently. That's a huge jump. Now, am I suggesting that any of us want to go back to where we were in 2016 in terms of our account values? Absolutely not. But what this does, again, it kind of widens the scope a little bit, and it gives me some perspective. In fact, if you look at this, what you'll notice is that even just a couple of years ago, in late 2018, the market was substantially lower than we are right now. But we don't tend to remember, that didn't get quite as much attention, didn't have coronavirus and the impacts on our society overall and every healthcare and everything else. But this helps me to sort of take a step back, relax a little bit, realize that maybe it's not as bad as it has sort of felt over these last couple of months. There again, it's nice that we've had this recovery. Obviously, that's been very welcome. Now, here's another thing that I think is important to remember. There's a number of ways to measure whether the market is overpriced or underpriced. And of course, at the end of the day, it comes down to opinion based on the data. But I think at virtually every sort of benchmark or gauge that somebody might look at to determine if the market is overvalued or undervalued, I think almost everyone would suggest that the market is way overvalued right now. This is just one way to do that. So this chart looks at the average PE ratio for all 500 stocks in the S&P 500. If you don't know what a PE ratio is, and I know many of you do, but it just is the price of a stock relative to the earnings of that company. So the higher the PE ratio, it really just suggests that that stock is priced really high relative to the earnings of the company. So if you look at this chart right now, the average as of, I think this was last week, was at 30. The average PE ratio in the S&P 500 was around 30. The historical median was about half of that, just under 16. So we're almost double the historical median. So this suggests that even though account values, we've had this volatility, certainly none of us want to see our account values go down, but the reality is this market has been, even a few months ago before we had this rebound back up, even then, some would suggest this market was way overpriced. Another way to look at that, as I said, there's several different things we could look at, but this is dividend yields. It's one other way to just measure whether the market's overpriced or underpriced and so forth. Well, you can see that dividend yields right now are at almost a historical all-time low. This just suggests that relative to the dividend, the amounts of the dividends, the stock prices are high relative to those dividends. And so the lower this ratio, the higher the market is priced. And as I said, this is looking at the average dividend yield for all 500 stocks. So there's other things I could show you, but as I said, they all sort of indicate that this market is overpriced. So that leads to what I want to show you here. This is a quote from an article that I liked. It got my attention. And this is one of the things he said. Now, this was back in March, before the market rebounded and kind of started going the other direction. But this article, the author said, when valuations become attractive enough, courageous, contrarian-minded investors will step up to the plate and start buying. In other words, what he was talking about was similar to what I've just described, that even back in March, when the market was lower, substantially lower than it is now, even then, people were kind of saying, well, this market's still overpriced. I'm going to wait, because for some people, putting money into a market that is so overpriced, it's coming off a 10-year bull run, even for myself, just the contributions that I put in monthly to my retirement accounts, I started to ask, why do I keep putting money into this market that just keeps setting new all-time highs? You talk about buying high. And so I can understand this. And so I think that's another thing that's probably happened over these last few months is people kind of getting in. They felt like that was an opportunity to get back in at a little more reasonable price. But again, even then, it could be argued that it was still overpriced by quite a bit. So that leads to the next question. Have we seen the bottom? Now, a few weeks ago, this question was different. I said, when will we see the bottom? But I've since changed that because of that sort of V-shaped, rebound that I talked about with you a moment ago. So have we seen the bottom? Well, first of all, I can't tell you that. I wouldn't attempt to try to tell you that. And here's the reality. Nobody can. Nobody knows the answer to this question. Now, there's going to be lots of guesses. Some guesses will prove to be right when you look back. A lot of guesses will be proved to be wrong. If you want to know, here's proof. Watch CNBC or one of these channels for a little while, and they'll interview two different experts, quote unquote experts, back to back, and they'll have completely different views on what's going to happen in the markets. And they're pretty confident about their views. So that alone tells you that really nobody knows. And so that's important to keep in mind because there's a lot of tips out there, right? But here's what's really important. The market is generally considered a leading economic indicator. It makes complete sense. If you look back historically over all the recessions we've had, what you'll find typically is that the stock market begins to rebound about 4 to 6 months before the actual economy starts to improve. So really, when you think about that, the market in many ways is the collective opinion of investors of where the economy will be, let's say 6 months from now. That's why things can happen. We can get news that's not very favorable and the market doesn't really seem to mind. It's because they're not looking at today. They're looking at where we're going to be 6 months from now. So whatever news is coming out today, if it's not really changing what the longer term view is, then it's not going to impact the economy very much or the markets very much. So, for whatever reason, whether it's favorable news on treatments or vaccines or this reopening of economy, which I know there's still a lot of questions around, but economically, I think overall that's given a sense of optimism. And so all of those things are generating some positivity in the market. Could that change, the coming weeks if we get some news that appears to maybe be setting us on a different trajectory, then certainly that could change. But right now, I think that's kind of where we are. So now let's talk just for a moment about the housing market. Again, we're still talking about perspective here, that first of those three things. Talk very generally about the housing market. I'm not a real estate agent. I'm not, so I'm not going to speak in any great detail. But from a planning perspective, again, some of you may be trying to determine if this is a good time to sell a home or not. One of the things I would point out is that very much like what I described with the stock market, housing prices in our country are also at a historical all-time high. Even right now, they still are, surprisingly. So, you know, it's kind of like I said with the stock market. None of us want to see our account values come down. None of us want to see our home values come down. We'd all like to get what we want for our home. But coming off of, you know, again, a historical all-time high in terms of housing prices, the reality is that something was going to reset that sooner or later. So I think we need to really keep that in mind as part of the overall perspective. Now, one side note, lots of things can drive housing prices. We're building bigger homes today than in the past, so that certainly contributes to this. But I don't think anybody would question that just purely from an inflationary and growth standpoint, the housing market has gone up considerably quicker than other parts of the economy, perhaps. And so the question, should we sell or wait? You know, that's on a lot of people's minds. Should we just kind of wait till this all sort of blows over? Well, just a few things I'll mention. All of the projections right now of what's going to happen in the real estate market over the rest of this year, I mean, projections are that, you know, real estate will decline by 2 to 4%. Now, that can vary from one market to another. It can even vary from one neighborhood to another in terms of your inventory and demand, obviously. But nationally speaking, that can, if you think about the Great Recession, we were down about almost 30%. Housing prices were down almost 30%. So even if these projections prove to be wrong, and even if values come down 5 or 6 or 7%, that's well beyond, or much better, obviously, than what we faced during the Great Recession, because things are just, you know, the whole mortgage application process, the fundamentals are better now than they were then. Inventories are still very tight in many markets. I can't speak specifically to all the markets that you all are in, but really when you think about it, as one realtor explained it to me, the equilibrium in so many markets hasn't changed. What I mean by that is that while there are fewer buyers in many cases because of everything going on economically, there also are fewer sellers because people have been holding off or have delisted their homes and things like that. And so, as he put it to me, you may not get, or he said, you may only get 3 offers on your home instead of 10, you know. So as I said, I know that can vary from one market to another, but still, you know, it's still a great market. It's still a seller's market in many areas. Now, another thing that he mentioned to me, the realtor I talked to, that I thought was really interesting, he said, you know, if all of those who have either delisted or kind of waiting to sell their home, if all those people, along with those who ultimately end up needing to sell their home just because of their economic situation, if all that happens at the same time, that could drive up inventories later. So I don't know whether that will come to fruition. I don't know if that will be 4, 6, 8 months from now. Who knows? But, you know, his point was that could make it tougher to sell a home later than it is now, because right now the fundamentals all look pretty good in many markets. Obviously, record low mortgage rates are going to continue to help. We hit another record low just last week, or maybe it was even yesterday. Everything's changing so fast I can't keep up, but rates under 3%. So people don't want to miss out on that. As you all know, or may know, for every 1% mortgage rates go up, that decreases purchasing power by 10%. People don't want to lose that much purchasing power. So while rates can only help so many people, there's no question that that's going to continue to help, and nobody knows how long that'll last. And so there will always be that sort of, I think that push to get in on those low rates. But lastly, if you're somebody that says, I'm going to wait, here's what I would suggest, and this leads to where I want to go next, but know what you're waiting for. Make sure you've clearly defined what it is that you're kind of looking for, what your parameters are that you're willing to work within, because if you don't have that clearly defined, then you could just be waiting indefinitely, or perhaps waiting until a time where it's more difficult to achieve your objectives than it is now. So that's a little bit about a perspective. Now let's talk about objectives. As I said earlier, it's so important to maintain or to have clear objectives, because you can't, at least as far as the stock market goes, you can't measure the effect that market changes will have on your plan if you don't have clear objectives. It becomes kind of an arbitrary plan where I want to earn as much as I can in my retirement accounts or my investments and lose as little as I can. But that's not really a plan. And that's really difficult to plan around. You know, that's again, it's kind of an arbitrary thing. So let's talk for a moment about specific objectives. First, I kind of break it out between primary and secondary. So primary objectives may look like this: to never run out of money to live comfortably. That's pretty easy. It's pretty straightforward. To never run out of money to live comfortably. Now, in that case, that might mean you can even draw down on some of your principal, you know, over your lifetime if that's your only objective. Now, you might say to never run out of money to live comfortably and to leave X amount to my family or to my charity or a charity or to both. Now, for some people, they might say, well, I just want to leave all I can. Well, again, that's tough to plan around. But if I know what you need to live comfortably, I know how much you have in savings and investments and retirement accounts, and I know what you want to have at the end, it's so much easier to connect the dots, run the projections, and I could look at that. I say me, as I said, I'm not in the planning business anymore, but just speaking from the standpoint of an advisor, I could look at that and say, okay, well, you know, here's the thing. Yeah, the market's down 30%, but it really hasn't impacted your ability to meet your objectives. In other words, the probability of meeting your objectives has not really changed much. But too often people don't look at those things, and they just their gut reaction is to become fearful without really knowing how it impacts their objectives. And if you don't have those objectives, then you don't know. Now, secondary objectives. You may have things like this: to not be a burden on my family. Obviously, many of you, if not all of you on this call, are in discussions with staff members of the various communities, the organizations supporting this call here today. This may be a driving factor for you. You don't want to be a burden on your family, and maybe you want to have your own plan in place so that you don't have to experience that, or that your family doesn't. Maybe you say to protect against the cost of long-term care. These are just a couple of examples. There could be many others, but these secondary objectives are important too, and these kind of flow up into those primary objectives and have to be planned for financially and otherwise. So now let's talk about the third piece, plan. We've talked about perspective, objective, and now plan. So how do we plan? Well, there's lots of different ways to do things. I'm a big fan of keeping it simple. Logically, this is what makes sense to me. This kind of ties together what I was just talking about. What I suggest people do is first look at all of your what I call fixed income or stable income sources. In other words, your non-investment related income. Set any, investment related income aside for a minute. Dividends, interest, growth, all that. Set that aside. What are all of your other income sources? For most of you, that's going to include Social Security, maybe pension for some of you, possibly rental income could go in this category, but whatever those sort of reliable, long-term income sources, and you want to add all those up, monthly or annually, however you look at it. And then you want to look at your expenses, your discretionary and also non-discretionary expenses. Obviously, discretionary is where you have some wiggle room if you need to make adjustments, but add all of those up. And then you're going to look at the difference. Now, obviously, it doesn't take a scholar to really understand that that's going to produce either a shortfall or a surplus. Now, some of you may have a surplus. All of your non-investment related income sources may cover all of your living expenses. That's an enviable position because that means you don't have to be as concerned about what's happening with your investments. But the reality is most people in retirement, there's a shortfall. That's the whole reason we have retirement accounts and IRAs and things like this to begin with, is to supplement or to cover that shortfall between our expenses and all those other income sources, to cover that gap. So with that being said, if there's a shortfall, as I said, it probably is for most of you, that's not uncommon, then the question is, okay, we know how much that shortfall is, X amount per month or per year, however you look at it. And then, you look at all of your other savings, investments, retirement accounts, and so forth. And it's just a very simple projection at that point, working with your financial professional. The question really is, even with what's happened in the market, even if my accounts are down 10 or 20 or whatever they are, That's not the reality right now, as I showed you earlier. But I'm just giving that as an example. Even if you're in a situation where your account's down, then the question is, okay, do I still have enough there to support that shortfall and still meet my long-term objectives? And that's really what it comes down to. And in many cases, the answer may still be yes. And then we don't have to panic as much. But that's why the objectives are so important, to have those clearly defined. Okay. So now that we've talked about those three components, let's talk about planning beyond finances. Because if I use the phrase retirement planning, which, by the way, it doesn't end at retirement. Retirement planning continues through retirement. Maybe it takes a little different form, but it's still very important. But if I use that phrase retirement planning, most people immediately think of finances and investments. But here's something I want to show you. This is a survey done several years ago by Merrill Lynch. They asked people 65 and older, what are some of your biggest concerns about living a long lifetime? And you can see the answers right here. Serious health problems, number one. No big surprise there. Not being a burden on family, I mentioned that a moment ago, is one of those secondary objectives. Even things like being lonely, not having a purpose, so forth and so on. If you were to stop and think about what peace of mind represents for you at this point in your life, I would venture to say that for many of you, it's probably the opposite of what you see on the screen. In other words, the extent to which you can protect against or minimize these concerns, that's going to increase your peace of mind. Now, there's certainly other things, but these are some of the top ones. So as we think about that, I would like to encourage you to think about a retirement plan much more broadly than just your finances and your investments. So I look at a retirement plan as having four categories. The first, of course, is finances. I mean, obviously that is an important part of it. And the other three that I'm going to show you do come back to this in some way. But the first category, you know, if you think about that survey I showed you a moment ago, two of the concerns were running out of money and having nothing to leave family. Obviously, those would fall under that category. The next category is what I call preventative health, or maybe I would say wellness or lifestyle. And two of those concerns from the previous slide would go in this category: being lonely, not having a purpose. Those are real concerns among perhaps some of you on this call, many retirees and older adults. And so obviously this is a wellness conversation, not just physical fitness. Obviously we're talking social, intellectual, vocational, emotional, spiritual, so forth and so on. All of these things are important not only to your health today, but they do come back to finances in the sense that the healthier lifestyle you're living today and all those different components of wellness, that can help limit healthcare costs in the future. Now, there's outliers. There's some things that just happen no matter how healthy we are. But on average, we know that's true. So it does kind of come back to finances. But then there's the next piece, what I call your post-health event plan. In other words, what if something did change? You know, our health can change gradually in many cases, but also it can change suddenly and unexpectedly. And it can turn our whole lives upside down, and that of our families sometimes. It can be a very difficult situation. So in that situation, what is the plan? This is what I call your post-health event plan. And so, again, that survey earlier, the number one answer was serious health problems. Clearly, that would go into this category. And then lastly, family. What involvement would you want from your family in that kind of a situation? Remember one of those answers. The second most popular answer was not being a burden on my family. We could perhaps put estate planning in here and some other things, but these are the four categories. They are all interrelated, and they all do kind of come back to finances. But here's an important point that I think a lot of folks don't stop to really understand or even think about. Where a person lives throughout their retirement years actually plays a really big role in all of these things. I don't have time to get into it too much, but you can imagine, I mean, just think about it. I'll just pick a category, like the bottom right, family. Where you live plays a really big role in that. You know, like if some health event did take place unexpectedly, you know, what would be the impact on your family? Would you require their health? Would you be a burden on your family? Those kind of things. What's the financial impact, not only on you, but on your family members of maybe having to take time away from their career or what have you? Where you live plays a really important role in that. It does with preventative health as well and all those social and wellness aspects. So thinking about that is an important part of your plan. So with that, I want to talk very briefly about retirement living options. Many of you on this call, maybe you've done a ton of research and you already kind of know where you want to go from here. Some of you, maybe you're just now starting to think about a retirement community, one of the UMRC or Porter Hills locations or what have you. You're gathering your research. I'm just going to share a little bit with you that might be helpful. First of all, the terminology in the senior living industry can be extremely confusing. You can see some of the different terms on here, and I use these sometimes because after all, there's situations where you kind of have to use terminology. But the problem from the consumer standpoint is that I've seen these things used interchangeably or incorrectly on different websites, and it can really just be confusing to people. And so what I tend to do is tell people, don't get too caught up in all the different terminology and the different categories, because at the end of the day, there's really four trade-offs, four key areas, trade-offs that if you're looking at a retirement community or comparing different communities, then you need to understand how these trade-offs work. And if you do, then all the terminology doesn't really matter. Number one, obviously, is the cost today. What's it cost to live there? When I say today, I mean, while you're not in need of any type of long-term care or care services, you're living independently, maybe still very active. What's the cost to live there? Obviously, you're going to have a monthly fee, in some cases, maybe an entry fee, but what's the cost to live there today? Second, what are the hospitality services and amenities? Now, this is a broad category. You might even include things in here like the location, the view, the different types of floor plans available. But, the reality is some communities simply provide more than others in terms of the types of services and amenities that are available. Obviously, that's going to have an impact on the cost today. And you need to think about what's important to you, what you're really looking for, what's the best fit for you, and all these kind of things. All of that's important. But you also want to think not just about today, but about the future. What types of care are available if you should need it in the future, or if something changed unexpectedly? What types of care are available? Some retirement communities provide very little in the way of care. Maybe they contract with a nursing group, some type of an in-home health care group or something, and they'll bring people into your apartment or something like that. Others maybe provide a little bit of assisted living or what have you, and then still others provide, a much more broad continuum of everything from independent to assisted living and memory care, nursing care, and so forth and so on. And so many of the UMRC communities and Porter Hills locations hosting this call, I know they fall in that category where there's just a much more broad range of services. So you need to think about what you need or want, not just today, but going forward. And then finally, what's the cost of that care? Whatever care they do have available, what's the cost of it? And so there's trade-offs in all of these things. You might find that some communities you pay more. And now let me say this, all other things being equal, you would pay more today, but maybe less if you need care. In other cases, maybe you pay less today, but more if you need care. Obviously the level of services and hospitality services and amenities, that's going to obviously have an impact on the monthly cost. So all of these things are the trade-offs that, as long as you understand these, it makes it much more easy to do a comparison. So I know that, say, again, with the communities hosting this call today, I think a lot of them provide like a discounted cost on different care services and things like that. So you'll find that it's all over the map, but you just have to understand how those things work. So let's talk about a really conceptual. Actually, I'm not going to spend too much time on this in the interest of time. So let me just sort of move away. Well, I'll spend just a moment on this. So if you look at it, a lot of retirement communities you'll find out there, they're just rental communities, right? Where you pay a monthly rate month to month. And then if you need some type of care in the future, assisted living, nursing care, you'll pay the full cost of that care at that time. And you know, obviously it's the more care you need, the higher it goes up. Then you'll have some entry fee communities where you'll pay a lower cost, you know, per month. Maybe you pay an entry fee, but your monthly cost is lower. But then you still pay the full cost for health care services or long-term care services, things like that. You'll have some other options where, you know, you pay a much higher amount per month. But then if you ever need care, it doesn't really change much. It just stays, your monthly cost stays about the same. And then you've got communities like many of those hosting this call today where you pay your month to month, and if you ever need care, as I said, it's discounted. So it's kind of a sort of, I call it the Goldilocks solution. It's kind of right in the middle. So you only pay for care if you need it, but you don't pay the full market rate. So that's a good sort of a blend between some of the other options that are out there. So for people that don't know which is best, that's a really good sort of middle road option. So I know the staff, the host communities for this call can obviously talk to you more about this kind of thing. But that all kind of goes back to those trade-offs that I mentioned. So now let's talk just for a moment about just obviously coronavirus, everything taking place there, and you know, kind of what's going on right now, response from residents in the industry, because I know obviously this is on a lot of people's minds. I think it's important to really think about, when we talk about senior living in particular and the impact of coronavirus, I think we have to separate in our minds what I call care settings from independent living. Now, care settings, what I'm talking about is nursing care, assisted living, things like that. So let's talk about that piece first. We know that the impact of coronavirus, COVID-19, has been most felt in nursing care overall, nationally. Many of the standalone, or what I'd call freestanding nursing homes, is really where we've seen some of the biggest impact in terms of coronavirus. Some, unfortunately, were not very well managed. Others were well managed, but obviously it's a very difficult situation, a very difficult virus to contain sometimes. But mostly in nursing care. And it's been perpetuated in many ways by, in some cases, certainly not every, but in some cases, a lack of early response, a lack of proper protocols, and that's really sad in cases where that happened. The vast majority of providers really did the right things early on. They really jumped into this early, put those protocols in place, and it's made a big difference. We don't hear about that. You only hear about the bad cases, but the reality is the vast majority of nursing facilities, certainly retirement communities, have not had these major outbreaks like we hear about on the news. Now, I'm not trying to minimize the severity of those. That's obviously very unfortunate for those individuals and the organization and the families, but you know, that's not the reality for many, many locations. But like many things, those are what we hear about. But the other thing that's perpetuated this, obviously, is the asymptomatic spread, and for many communities, lack of resources, protective equipment, tests, and these kind of things. So even for those communities that have put all the right procedures in place, it's still been a very uphill battle just because some of these additional challenges. Now, I know in looking at the website for Porter Hills and UMRC, I was really impressed to see very little in the way of any of this, which is really just super impressive because, again, even many communities that have done all the right things have still had some cases, you know, maybe not huge outbreaks, but a fair number of cases. But it looked like that had been kept to a minimum from what I could see on the website. So that was really impressed by that. Another thing is a lot of these nursing homes that are where the states are now reporting cases, what they don't say is that a lot of times they have those cases have been sent to them from a hospital. So somebody gets discharged from a hospital and they go to a nursing home, and maybe that place didn't have any cases before, and then they get reported as having cases, which is really unfair to that organization because obviously, you know, they're doing the right things and taking these residents in and trying to care for them, but then they're getting bad press on that. So some of those things that you don't hear about as much. But here's the big thing for me. I'm an optimist, and I really believe that everything that's happening, the industry is going to learn so much that I think is only going to help people in the future. Any of you on the call today, if you don't, maybe you'll never need nursing care, but if you ever do, my hope is that everything being learned now will only make that better in the future. I'm already seeing, just this morning I read a really neat article where there's some new technology already being developed that really helps with early detection and prevention of outbreaks like this. So we're already seeing technology developments around this that will help things happen much more swiftly and earlier, that will prevent these kind of things better in the future. We're seeing a lot about concierge services, which have almost had to, be ramped up because of everything that's going on. But what I'm hearing is that those are probably going to stick around now because they work so well. We are kind of in a concierge type society now with Uber and all these different things. So I think we'll see more of that, which will probably be really good for the industry. Obviously, protocols will be tightened up and some different procedural things there. And even in designs and physical designs, we'll probably see some changes. A little too early to know exactly what all those changes will look like, but I think whatever they are, it'll only be for the better. That's my belief. But now let's talk for a moment about independent living. So it's a little bit different because obviously those who are in independent living have more flexibility. They're able to go out and at many communities. Now, I know this can vary from some places to another, but in general, residents can go out and take walks around that community or that campus. Maybe some communities actually have nature trails or what have you, where people are still getting out. I've talked with several communities where they said their residents are taking up biking. Some of them are doing these adult, like 3-wheel bikes, but that's become a really big thing. Residents are outdoors doing more. Obviously, that helps. What I found was that early on, this is somewhat, anecdotal, somewhat subjective, but my outside view in talking, I get lots of emails from people. I talk with lots of different retirement communities and the staff, and I hear different stories. Overall, what I've found is that residents, when this all started to happen, were a bit fearful at first, just as all of us were, but that seemed to give way pretty quickly. By and large, not for everybody, but many people actually started to realize, you know what, I actually feel better where I am than anywhere else. I actually feel safer here, and I feel provided for better here than I would be somewhere else. And so what I've seen since that time is this sense of gratitude. I've seen so many things have been sent to me, testimonials and all these things. But this overwhelming sense of gratitude for the staff and the services that are being provided during this time, and this sense of community. I've recognized that the sense of community, even though people are having to socially isolate, is still very strong in so many locations. Even though people can't be as close, even though it's less than ideal, and it's been less than ideal for all of us, frankly, but I realize it's not an easy situation. But knowing you're a part of something, that community, that sense of community, it goes back to wellness in many ways. I think that's been really, really important for a lot of residents at a lot of retirement communities. This is actually a quote from we collect a lot of articles at our company, and this is one that I found. Dallas Morning News interviewed a resident, and he said the residents that he's talked to feel far from trapped. They're grateful. If there's a good place to be at a time like this, it's here, he said. And then he went on, he says, people share the good times and the bad times. And so we'll make it through this. And so, that was, I think, this is really reflective of what I was describing a moment ago, this idea that, number one, I feel grateful to be here. And number two, we together as a part of a community will make it through this. And he went on to talk about how he couldn't imagine being out in his own home right now with all this going on. So I hear a lot of things like this. Again, I know it's not always ideal. And the reality is some retirement communities do a better job than others of providing for the residents right now. So all that's obviously has to be taken into consideration. But overall, I'm hearing a lot of stories like this one. Just a few things that to maintain that sense of community that I'm seeing. Socially distant block parties and happy hours, things like that. I mentioned the outdoor. I've seen like cooking classes. I saw one community where the local chef or the community chef was doing cooking classes to residents by video, and that had been very well received. Obviously, a lot of things to kind of stay, resilient and creative during this time. Lastly, I get this question a lot. I'll hear people say, well, is it better off to just stay in your home now or what have you? And I've talked a little bit about independent living, that sense of community and the flexibility, but for those people who are either needing care or close to needing care, this is a really difficult situation because all of the challenges of aging in place, if you will, staying in your own home, are magnified during this time. As I said earlier, I'm not suggesting that there's one size fits all. Some things work great for some people, not for others, but generally speaking, I think aging in your own home, if you will, is easier in theory than in practice. And I think it's only more difficult with everything going on now. Having caregivers in and out of the house, not knowing what their exposure has been. Just the caregiver shortage that we have in this country to begin with is magnified right now. Just something as easy as receiving meals, getting your meals on a regular basis. The social isolation component that's always important is even more important right now, or even more difficult perhaps right now. On and on, involvement in family, how involved they can be, and all these kind of things. So real challenges there. So all of that has to be weighed out, I think, when people are thinking about the different options. So anyways, with that, before I turn it back over to James, just a quick summary. Number one, have clear objectives and plan accordingly. Without those objectives, it really makes it difficult to even have a plan. Number two, keep perspective. Without perspective, our emotions start to take a driver's seat. Keep it simple. I talked about retirement planning and, kind of your expenses versus your fixed income sources, and then, where you go from there in terms of your retirement accounts and all. Remember that retirement planning is more than just financial planning and all those different components of retirement planning, and that, where you live actually plays a really big role in your retirement plan. What is learned now, I think, is only going to help going forward when it comes to our senior living, certainly when it comes to, those higher levels of health care, nursing type care. I think we're going to learn a lot from what's happening right now. And then finally, the challenges of aging in place are magnified at this time. So while some people may say, I'd rather be home, when you really stop and think about it, there's some real challenges with that. And I know a lot of people are just simply lonely. Some people are scared being in their own home. They're scared if something changed with their health all of a sudden, where that would lead them. So just a lot of different things to weigh out when thinking about that. So anyway, I have used all of my time and a few more minutes beyond that even. So I want to thank you all so much for your time. Really appreciate it. James, I don't know, I think you wanted to maybe do some questions, so I'm going to go ahead and call you back on if you're there.
All right. Hello, everybody. So Brad, I want to thank you very much for the presentation. It was extremely informative. I felt like I learned quite a bit there, especially with some of the understanding the financial market. So at this time, if anyone does have a question, you can type it into the chat function. I wrote a couple of notes during the presentation, so if you did not read those, that may be green on your screen where it says chat at the bottom. So we'll wait just a couple minutes and see if we have any questions come up, Brad.
Okay, sure.
Okay. In the meantime, I thought it would be interesting to kind of dovetail on the back of your presentation there. We are seeing a lot of people that are saying, I don't want to spend another COVID season in my house. And so I'm equating this to almost like a 3-month snowstorm, where we get a lot of that here in Michigan, that when you get a really bad winter and people say, I don't want to do this again. And so COVID's kind of the same thing, where that it's a different life when you're living in the community than it is when you're living in your own home. And we're seeing some, actually some other parts of that as well, where we're seeing some independent living residents that are, because they were sequestered for such a long period of time, that they're actually now needing some assisted living services. And it's nice with our campuses because that's right on the same campus. So you can get that care that you need right there on campus, even if it's temporary. We have someone coming actually from a independent living community with no assisted living or skilled nursing, one of ours. It's one of our UMRC and Porter Hills campuses. And that resident needs a little bit of physical therapy. They had surgery right before COVID and they're looking for a little bit of help. And so she's actually moving in and spending 30 days with us. So here is a good question here. It is from Ms. Harmon. How do I know if a CCRC is financially secure? That's a very good question. We are a not-for-profit organization. What that means is that no one person or group of persons benefit financially from the running of this organization. It's actually governed by a board of volunteer board members. So when we look at why we are in business, we are in business really for just to increase the mission. So there are no shareholders, there are no bondholders or those kinds of things that are sitting there saying, hey, we want a better return on our money. Really what we're looking at is we run this community really just for the residents. United Methodist Retirement Communities in Porter Hills together is the second largest senior living provider in the state of Michigan. Most people don't know that. Because our campuses are so unique and eclectic to themselves that it doesn't feel like you come from a large organization, and we really like that, and we like the autonomy of each campus to be different. So that's really part of it. The other big part is that we are actually a very, very secure organization financially. We've been smart with our business decisions. We've taken a little bit of a hit with the finances like most people have during COVID, but we're seeing that start to come back now as well. The biggest part about a not-for-profit organization, I would say, is we are mandated by the state to provide what's called a disclosure statement. So when you place a deposit with one of our communities, we give you a disclosure statement. And the disclosure statement is basically our contract, but it also gives you the full finances of the organization. So you can see if the organization is well-funded or not. And that should help you give it a little bit of peace of mind. Another question came through here. Can I use my long-term care insurance at a retirement community? That is exactly true. Yes, you may. So what happens is if you go into assisted living or skilled nursing or have some services in your house, typically insurance programs are a reimbursement program. So what that means is that if you pay your fee, you submit that bill to your insurance company, and your insurance company would then reimburse you for those costs. But absolutely, you can only use long-term care insurance policies typically in a licensed organization, and obviously we're licensed, so that's a good one there too. Are there any other questions? All right, so here's one. I'm seeing Porter Hills and United Methodist Retirement Communities. How are these organizations connected? Actually, March was a year, and Porter Hills and United Methodist Retirement Communities as two not-for-profit organizations combined and created one organization for the state, which is the United Methodist Retirement Communities in Porter Hills. It is quite a mouthful. We all agree about that. The board also agrees. But we wanted to, again, keep the autonomy of both organizations during this time that we merged them together and make sure that we understand all the nuances of both sides and that we come up with an organization of one out of the two. So this was not a hostile takeover or anything like that. This is literally two mission-based, not-for-profit senior living organizations coming together to serve seniors. All right, well, it is 1:58. Oh, question for Brad. Is there a best time to move to a community, Brad?
Great question. I get that one a lot. And so here's the thing I always tell people is that there's not a good age, in my opinion, to move, because the reality is we all can age at different rates. Two people can be the exact age and be in two different, entirely different situations from a healthcare standpoint or a lifestyle standpoint. And so where I tend to look at that is really, the recognition that a retirement community is not just the physical structure, okay? The building, we all want a nice place to live. We all want the amenities and all those things. But what really makes a community is the people. It's the residents that live there. It is that literal community. And the thing about it is, as many of you know, it takes a while to build relationships. It takes a while. Some people move into a retirement community and from day one, they love it. They never look back. Others, it takes them a little while. There's an acclimation period, but whatever it may be, those relationships can take a little bit of time. And so I have found, my observation is that then it's kind of like the old house to a home kind of analogy. It takes a while for a house to become a home. And so once that begins to happen, those relationships start to get built and you're more ingrained in the culture, that's when people start to really love what a community offers. And so my advice is just to, do it early enough that you can be a part of that you can really build those relationships, because not only is that going to help now, but if something should change, this is what I hear a lot. If something should change and you do have to go to long-term care or nursing care, whatever it is, having that support network, those built-in relationships within that community to kind of walk that journey with you is extremely important, as opposed to just say, if somebody's in their home and all of a sudden something changes, they have to move to some care setting where they don't know anybody. It's just a really difficult thing. So that doesn't necessarily answer your question directly, but the value to me in a community like this is being a part of it and doing that early enough that you can become a part of it and then enjoy those relationships going forward.
Good. Thank you, Brad. So another question came through here. The cost of senior living is so expensive these days. Is there any help out there for people living on a fixed income? Brad, would you like to take that, or would you want me to go first?
I'm happy to try, but James, why don't you go ahead and take it, and I'll follow up if there's anything else.
Sure. So one of the factors that we work with is actuarial tables and actuarial organizations that help us determine how long people stay in retirement communities, how much are they willing to pay for it, all those kinds of things. And then we match that up against what does it cost to run a retirement community. And one of the things that we found is that people that live in retirement communities live about 5 to 7 years longer than they do in their own homes. Now, what's interesting is those 5 to 7 years are typically independent living years. So an example would be if you had Mary, who is 80 years old and lives at home, and there's a snowstorm outside, and Mary is going to have to go out and get groceries. She's going to have to go home and cook and clean and a little bit of worry about the house and those kinds of things. Her level of quote unquote risk is higher than someone who lives in a retirement community. So if you look at Betty, who lives in a retirement community, Betty may be, she's not going out into the snow. She's not grocery shopping. She's not cooking. All of those things are taken care of for Betty. And so what happens is, because Betty has less risk, the likelihood of Betty having some type of fall or injury is much less likely than Mary. And so Mary may need to go into assisted living at some point because she fell at the grocery store or whatever it may be, and would spend a longer time in assisted living because she's really kind of between independent living and assisted living. And so she can't live by herself. Betty may be 5 to 7 years older than Mary when she goes into assisted living. And so what we find is when you live at a retirement community, the average amount of time you spend in assisted living is about 1.5 to 2 years, and about 6 months in skilled nursing. So if you're looking at managing costs of long-term care, that is a helpful one. Being a little bit mitigating your risk as you live in an independent living setting will help you stay healthy longer and hopefully not need assisted living or skilled nursing as much. Brad, how does that sound to you?
Well, I think it sounds great. And I think there's two parts of that equation, and James has touched on the really important piece, which is when you think about costs, you can't just think about today. It's really thinking about lifetime cost. And you made some really good points, James, that many people maybe haven't thought about in terms of the lifetime cost and the long-term, potential implications. But I think on a short-term basis, obviously many people, and I don't know your particular situation, whoever asked the question, but for many people, there's some amount of home equity there that is typically used at the time in which they sell or move into that community, that they'll use that to certainly cover the monthly fees for a period of time, perhaps the entry fee if that's applicable and that kind of thing. And then it comes down to what I talked about in the presentation. For many people, I've found that it's more quote unquote affordable than they even realize, because a lot of the things that you pay for right now in your home are included in your monthly fee at that community. So I've found that a lot of people, when they put kind of pencil to paper and start to calculate that, they realize, well, gosh, I'm not going to be paying much more, if anything, than I'm paying right now in my home. So you have to kind of do you have to work through that. And I know the staff can help you. They probably have worksheets and things like that. I'd bet that they could go through that with you as well.
We do actually, Brad, have cost calculators where you can look at what are the costs in your home compared to what are the costs of living in a retirement community and those kinds of things.
Right.
All right, so it looks like we don't have any more questions. It's 5 after 2, so we want to be mindful of everyone's time. First, I want to thank everyone for coming. This was an amazing turnout, a great presentation, Brad. I'm really, really impressed with your level of knowledge and learning about this. Julie and Allie, you're welcome. Julie and Allie will be sending out an email to everyone that came. So you can have a copy of this presentation if you want to share it with friends or family or neighbors or children or whatever you want to do with it. You'll be getting that. So you'll know how to contact us after this because they're going to catch up with you. So I want to say thank you very much for everyone for coming, and I hope everybody has a great day. Thank you very much.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.